recently sent me a clip and asked me a really good question about it. In the clip, they end up in a bad situation, one which they could have avoided with better awareness, but their question wasn't about how to avoid it. On replaying the clip, they were able to see the player they needed to notice to avoid getting stuck, and they didn't need any more help with that. The question was about what to do once they were stuck in the bad situation, how they could have worked their way out of it. What actually happens in the clip is that the opponent's shots force them to move to the point where they end up running out of space and keep backing up until they actually fall off the stage. In theory, there's nothing I can tell them to do that will reliably get them out of this situation. The opponents have them cut off from any escape route, and they have an angle that will allow them to land their shots on the last position available to the player. It's a very thorough, unbeatable tactic. I think a lot of players get hung up on the idea that in a situation like this, there's nothing I can do, and they just kind of let it happen. Might even jump off the stage themselves on purpose. The only reliable answer here, in theory, is not to end up in this situation in the first place. I told the student this, but that wasn't all I told them. This reminds me of something I learned from playing Melee with a top 100 player when I was in college. It was a total mismatch. Over the 9 years I lived there, I never once beat him when he played his main character, and very rarely when he played any other character either. It takes a different mindset playing against someone that good to get anything of value out of the experience, because a lot of the time they're so good that they can make their scissors beat your rock, make up in execution for what you outplayed them on in decision making. Some people see that and just conclude that there's no point in really trying to learn from someone who's that much better, that they should seek out practice that's closer to the same level. But I do think there's a lot of value in it if you look at it a different way. Sometimes, for example, it can show you that something you've been relying on as part of your game plan doesn't actually work at higher levels, and that at some point, your opponents will start figuring out a counter to it. That's a great warning to get earlier in your progression as a player, so you don't get surprised by it later and end up with a bad habit that's been reinforced for hundreds more hours that's harder to break. If something does work against even such a strong player, now you know that it's a tactic that's theoretically sound at least some of the time, that you're onto something with that idea. Thinking that way puts you in a much more resilient mindset. It's freeing, in a way, to be able to resign yourself to the idea that winning against this player almost certainly won't happen right now, and to just try to learn from it instead. That frees you from a ton of subconscious baggage you might have in a closer match where you have expectations of yourself for how you'll perform, and those get in the way of thinking straight. All of that is good to think about in its own right, but the part of this whole experience that I'm reminded of by my student's clip is the way that I dealt with theoretically unwinnable situations. I ended up in those situations a lot playing my friend, and I'd recognize them a lot of the time. In a game like chess, it's pretty common to resign, to forfeit the game when some significant advantage has been won and theoretically the advantaged player should win. Among chess grandmasters, this makes some sense, because a lot of the time they can both see how the game should play out, and they'll respect each other to find the solution and win the game. They have more games to play, and they value their time too much to bank on the long shot odds a mistake gets made. But bad situations in fast-paced games like Splatoon or Melee don't take as much of your time to play out, and they're mechanically a lot easier for your opponents to screw up, even if they've got a lot of practice. So when I was way off stage, looking at a well-flowcharted edgeguard from one of the better players of my character, who knew not only what he could do to stop me, but also what I could do to stop him better than I did, I could have just said, this is going to end in me losing a stock, and given up. But I didn't. I made an effort and gave him a chance to screw up his counterplay. If he plays theoretically perfectly, I don't make it back to the stage. But he's a human being. He's not theoretically perfect. So my best chance is to force him to play theoretically perfectly and hope he makes a mistake. What ended up happening, which certainly helped, was that he decided to go for more flashy, risky options because he was bored of the obvious rinse and repeat options that were really the best practices. In doing so, he'd open himself up to counterplay, and sometimes I was able to capitalize on that. I'd occasionally get a counter hit, force him to overcommit, sometimes even bait him into losing the stock himself because he tried to do too much off stage. And sure, most of the time I lost the stock anyway, most of the time he wouldn't have done those things in tournament, but because I was looking for ways back and testing his execution every time, it wasn't just that I occasionally got a few stocks I otherwise wouldn't have taken. I also got better at recovering to the stage. When I would play against more evenly matched opponents, I found way more flaws in their edgeguarding to exploit. I'd already seen far crazier ideas tried against me, and tried against me with better execution, and I'd challenged myself to find ways to beat them even then. If someone gave me even the smallest opening, I knew what to do to make them screw it up. And because what I'd done had even worked sometimes on a top player, it had a pretty good chance of working on a lower level player than them. Being able to make it back to the stage is huge in Smash, and coming back to Splatoon, being able to get a trade out of a lose-lose situation is also a really big deal. You can theorize all day about how this situation is hopeless, and that the odds of succeeding here are about the same as just jumping off the map, whether the player did that on purpose or not. But I'm telling you, go for the trade every time. If you really are 100% stuck and don't see a way out, make the players earn it if they want to get the splat clean. Make them fire that extra Trizuka shot at you instead of being able to save it for someone else on your team. Test their ability to aim, even if they've passed the test every time so far, even if all you're doing is making it take longer for them to pass the test. I can't count the number of times I've had an advantageous fight against an opponent, but because they tested my aim and kept moving, I missed and lost track of them for long enough that they reversed the situation. Even if you've got 10 seconds left on the clock and the enemy team has the lead, I don't care. Throw yourself at the zone anyway, and give yourself a chance to pop off and get a triple and save the game. Even if it works once every 100 times, you're doing 1% better than you would be by giving up. Even if it never works, you're getting better at it, and the skills you develop by trying and failing will pay off in the future more than what you're not developing by giving up. Never just assume your opponent wins and stop playing the game to let them win. Always give them as many chances as you can for them to screw up.